electric outlets for the first time in their life. So yes, they're going to use more coal. And that barring some sort of great technological development, we're not going to be able to say, okay, well, new regulations on cars, new regulations on refining fuels, new regulations on capturing CO2 under the ground, which is one of the ideas they have. That cannot possibly get us, you won't find an honest environmentalist who says that we can get there without basically telling the developed world, you guys are going to have to drive about 1/100th of what you're driving. Really, the people who say we can do it are people who are bullish on hydrogen energy or nuclear energy. And the other thing is, we don't know. Climate is climate. It is the most chaotic and unpredictable thing we have out there. We don't know what added greenhouse gas concentrations is going to do. General warming effect, yes, there are glaciers melting, could cause some sea level rise, but there are all sorts of complex feedback loops. Some of them are positive feedback. In other words, you melt some ice, that means there's less white stuff to reflect the light back up, so that means it's warmer. Some of them are negative feedback loops, where warming then can contribute to a reduction of, it makes more plants grow, which allows them to absorb more CO2. And people make lots of models, and the models are always best guesses. And so, yeah, there are odds pointing in one direction or another. But to go to the insurance policy, there's an odd, it's raining like crazy over in DC, where we both live. I don't have flood insurance because I'm on top of a hill, and we've never had a flood insurance is complicated, so I'll pick a different example. I buy insurance for things. I don't have insurance for, zombies rising from the grave. I don't have insurance for lots of possible problems, and I'm not willing to pay. If somebody told me the fire insurance on your house will be $2,000 a month, I would say I'd rather deal with the risk of my house burning down in a fire. If my house burns down in a fire next month, well, then I'm out of luck. If my house burns down in a fire 20 years from now, then 10 years from now, then I made the right decision. It's possible that letting ourselves adapt to a little bit of climate change imposes much less costs on our quality of life than fighting some sort of quixotic battle to control the makeup of the atmosphere. So the climate change, that's why the who's benefiting matters. Because now you see why there's so much certainty coming in, because you see, I follow these lobbyists, and they spend years saying, no, we don't want these regulations because of X and Y, and then they say, okay, if I think these regulations are kind of likely to happen, I'll get on board with them, I'll position my business to profit from them. So that's where much of the certainty comes from, is people who said, okay, we're going to position our businesses, or we're going to position our political party to act as if this is a certainty. And that's where a lot of it comes from. And to quote the professor, the price of inaction could be New York City and Miami underwater. Now, some of you aren't old enough to remember, but that's the rhetoric that George Bush's people used when he said the price of inaction could be a mushroom cloud over New York for not invading Iraq when we thought Saddam Hussein might have had weapons of mass destruction. It was the rhetoric that Bush's administration also used about a Wall Street bailout. Now, a lot of people agree, well, we needed to bail out Wall Street. We needed to invade Iraq. I don't agree with either of those. I think this is something, and I doubt Professor Swire could disagree with this generalization. Politicians always want more power. They're always looking for crises to grab onto in order to get more power. Much of the environmental movement and most of the climate change regulation movement is an attempt by politicians to get more power. One of the things they have to do is scare you. And the environmental groups will run ads where they've got this big train running down the tracks at these little kids who are standing there. I mean, it's a despicable scare tactic, especially because, well, I'll just say, it's another example of government trying to scare people. There are free market ways. You said, should we act to mitigate it? Yes. Again, stop subsidizing oil and coal. Stop subsidizing driving. Those would be two big things. We subsidize energy. The government subsidizes, if you live in New England, low-income heating energy subsidies where they pay some of your energy bills, which encourages people to use more energy. If we are going to subsidize poor people who can't pay their energy bills, there are better ways to do it. And this is not a free market solution, but a smarter government solution is give them a lump sum. All right, if it's a really cold winter, we're spend it all on your bills. There are all sorts of ways without increasing government control to reduce the amount of CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. But again, to go back to where I started, to stop the climate from changing. Now, first of all, it's sort of a Goldilocks idea, like, oh, well, this one's just right. Some planet too hot, some planet too cold. No, the climate's been changing forever. It was much warmer in the medieval period than it is now. It was much colder during the Ice Age than it is now. We don't want the climate to change rapidly, yes, but to try to freeze in place the climate as the CO2 concentrations of climate as it is now would be impossible. And to even come close to doing that would have huge costs on our ability to manufacture anything, to provide energy, to allow China and India and the third world to develop, again, where people will have light bulbs and light sockets. And these costs, the politicians will try to hide those costs from you, and they'll try to exaggerate the costs of inaction. But that's what politicians have always been doing, saying you need to give us more power right now. And the responsibility of American citizens is to stand up and say, no, we need more proof that we need to give you more power right now. Because they're going to take that power, and they're often going to reward their friends, and they're going to abuse that power. And on something as unpredictable as climate, it seems it's an insurance policy that, like much of what the insurance company sells, is a big ripoff. Thank you.
We're having a pretty civil tone here, which I like. I prefer that to throwing things at people. But we do have some disagreements, and so I'm going to just try to point out. One is the Greeks had a word for it. I can't remember from debate, but Tim started something like this. I'm not going to say that Professor Swire used the term climate denier, but when they talked about climate deniers, that raises the specter of the Holocaust. But I'm not going to talk about that. Right? I think that's fairly close to a quote of the opening thing. Okay, well that's fine. So I got the Holocaust even though I didn't say it, and so now I'm killing people and it's really bad. And I'm sorry, I apologize for any deaths caused by my not saying those words. But a second thing is, Tim said, that politicians always want more power. That's true. Businesses want profits. Law students want good grades. There's a bunch of things people want in life, and it's worth noticing that. But it's the same logical point that I made before. Just because businesses want to make profits doesn't mean they're going to harm us by making profits. Just because we have some problem or a politician turns out to get some ability to get clean air doesn't mean it's wrong to get clean air. You don't just say, hey, they're following their self-interest. You try to set up institutions that lead to good outcomes. And then the last word is that there was a statement about unpredictable. Climate's unpredictable. I agree with that. It's really hard to run a controlled experiment where you heat up the Earth a lot and you don't heat up the Earth a lot. I don't know how to run that. We don't have the alternate reality, world view things that would do that in the science fiction books. We're stuck with one world. Usually, when you face unpredictable, it's a good time to get insurance. That's why you do it. You don't know when lightning's going to hit your house. You don't know when somebody's going to hit your car. That's what you do with unpredictable. You try to figure out how to address it. And then the idea that you have to build a coalition of people who care. We're going to need companies and political support and people with different views and national security supporters who don't like being reliant on foreign oil. Yeah, you got to create a coalition of people to take action. That's known as democracy. It's known as having to convince a lot of people to do stuff. And a lot of times our problem is inaction in the Senate, that it's easier to block stuff that has to happen, and everyone knows it ought to happen, but you can't get somebody confirmed because one senator is saying no, or you can't get a bill through because 40 senators thwart the view of the 60 senators. So we have a lot of structural problems in all this that leads to the question of, well, what do we do? Now, I think we got a sense of where the factual differences are. So Tim did not say climate isn't heating up. I don't think we're warmer than any time in the future. I think we're the warmest ever on record by many, many measures, but I don't have all the facts. But what he did say is action doesn't matter, that the scale of action won't make a big difference to the stuff that's coming down the road. And that's where I did talk to my one friend who does climate change work, and he cited something that I didn't get to read before this called the Stern Report, which was done in Britain. And maybe I haven't read it, I don't know if it's right, but a senior advisor to the British government to this big report, and they said the costs of inaction were about 10 times the cost of actually doing things to address climate change. That, in other words, there is a causal impact from doing nothing. I'm not in a position to assess those facts, but somebody I trust, who I've worked with, who I think is a smart guy and doesn't give us BS statistics, he gives us pretty good statistics, thought that that was, that did have a lot of efficacy. And part of it is that when you look at the costs, you have to figure out the costs in context. So the same friend cited to me a National Association of Manufacturers study. Now NAM is pretty skeptical of climate change. And their study has the biggest cost, he said, of any of the studies that are out there. And the study leaves out lots of things like the way we'd innovate if we had changes, we wouldn't have the high cost. And then he said the number that you come out with is between $2 and $4 trillion to address climate change in an effective way. Now, even in Washington, that's a big number. You know, $700 billion for TARP, goes down to $150 billion because it's been paid back by the banks. You know, all this kind of stuff. But so let's say it's $2 to $4 trillion by 2030, over 20 years. In an economy that right now is about a $12 trillion annual economy, it'll be 16 or whatever by then. That means we would get to the same level of GDP growth about 3 months later by 2030. So great big dollars, 2 to 4 trillion. Effect, we get to the same level of GDP of output and all that, and we get there three or 4 months later. If that's the price for actually not losing Miami and New York, if that's the price for not taking action, we can take this effective, it seems pretty crazy not to take the action. Now, by the way, if we spend all this money on climate change, some people will get rich. There'll be people with energy efficient businesses that'll get money from it. But that's known as investing in things that are more efficient and that are better for the economy than the old spouting pollution, worse for the environment ones before. So yeah, we're going to have a lot of costs if we try to change. But we're going to have a lot of costs, and from the science that I'm able to see, a lot more costs if we don't change. Thanks.
Thank you again, Professor Swire and Mr. Carney. At this point, we'll open up the forum to questions for our speakers. Yes.
Sounded like Professor Swire was arguing just for government action, regulation in general. I'm not sure if Mr. Carney is arguing against any action, but just you know, more efficient. It sounds to me like it's inefficient to say, okay, business, don't pollute over this level or use this percent of alternative energy sources that maybe we could directly subsidize the consumer or research and development. I mean, I think that's a little bit of what Mr. Carney was saying. And if that's the case, Professor Swire, do you advocate maybe like changing the way we look at regulating energy, conceding the point that government should be involved?
Well, I think that government subsidizing, you know, promising energies, I think that's often an example of what I was talking about at the beginning, which is they pick winners and losers, and they picked ethanol. Before that, they picked something called MTBE to be a fuel additive, and now in California that's illegal and it causes cancer in rats. I think we failed to get very specific, so I'll try to do it now. Correct me if you think I mischaracterized what the proposals are. Cap and trade is an idea that I'll give it in its most pure form, which is not how it's being considered in Congress recently, but that from manufacturing and energy industries, the government would say, this many million tons of greenhouse gases can be emitted. But to emit any of those, you are going to have to buy and then pay for it with a permit. So it's effectively a tax on anybody burning fuel. So that means anybody manufacturing, anybody driving their car, though you wouldn't have to pay for it for driving. And that's the main question when we're talking about climate change. Is that a policy? It's a policy I oppose and I deplore in its current institutions on Capitol Hill, where they start handing out some credits to the